Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's amazing to see how many people are in the room here. I see 50 participants. That is great and amazing, and probably more than we could have attracted if this was a normal time with a normal workshop somewhere in the US where people had to travel to. My name is Timo Heister. I'm one of the deal.II developers. And this workshop originally was planned as a physical hackathon that we are also running virtually this week. But we decided to do a one-day conference. And this is what you're watching right now. And originally organized by Wolfgang Bangerth and by me. You see the schedule on the website, and you also see the schedule on the screen right now. We have scheduled 5 talks by different developers about recent things that happened inside the library, especially also with focus on the 9.2 release that just happened. If you have questions, you can use the chat or you can raise your hand. I would prefer that over interrupting directly the speaker. And one of the moderators will look at this and give you the opportunity to ask the question either by writing or by speaking. The talks will be recorded if everything works. And if they are recorded, then you can also watch them later on. And otherwise, yeah, so this is the schedule. And I'm not going to bore you by talking much longer, but instead give the microphone and the screen to share to Wolfgang Bangerth. He doesn't need a big introduction, I think, in the deal.II community as one of the original authors of the library. So I'm not going to try to do that. Instead, I will stop sharing my screen and let Wolfgang share his screen.
All right, well, thanks, Timo. These are interesting times. Like Timo mentioned, what we really wanted to do is to meet in person between somewhere, I don't know, 12 or 14 of the principal developers in South Carolina this summer, and of course that isn't happening. We're all working from home, but we've been pretty productive over the last few days, and I think one of the things that we would like to do today is to share some of the progress that we've had over the last year, maybe also over the last 20 years. I'll show a few slides of that. In deal.II. And of course, the fact that we're all sitting at home, in my case, I'm looking out over a park and some snow-capped mountains in the back, so it could be worse. But it gives us the opportunity also to rope all of you in, things that would have been much more difficult if we were all around the world and we were in South Carolina. Nobody's traveling. Everybody has time to attend these kind of workshops, and so that's what we wanted to do today. It's certainly a bizarre kind of talk for me to give. It's only the second time I give a seminar online, but let's see how this goes. So let me share my screen. Here we go. So in the past, I don't know, 20 years or so, every time we had a users and developers workshop, I always gave a talk that we call the past and the future of deal.II, and I'm certain that some of the old timers are getting a little bit tired of this because much of it is the same every time, or at least the structure is the same every time. So what's the point of what we want to do today? Like I said, the principal developers are meeting for something that we call a hackathon, which is a way for us to set aside time to program, to plan, to fix stuff, to strategize what we want to do over the next year or maybe the next 5 years. And we thought it would be a good idea to talk to the broader community as well, what's going on. So for you, what we want to do today is to give you a little bit of an overview of what is happening in deal.II. Also for you to meet some of the principal developers. The majority of you live in countries where you cannot attend deal.II workshops. And so it's impossible for you to physically meet the principal developers, but this is an opportunity for you meet them virtually and to see how they look. And I suspect in my case, many of you have watched the video lecture, so you know how I look, but for most of the others, that's not true. To get to meet them on a more personal basis. Of course, for us, that also means that we hope that we get questions from you, that we can hear from some of our users what they think. And the whole point of this is to build personal connections. That I think we all know that when we know each other, when we interact with somebody, it is much easier to ask questions than it is on a mailing list, for example. That we just need to build a community. So in my case, this first talk is not very technical. It's not technical at all. I'm just going to tell you a little bit of where this project came from for those of you who don't know it, and maybe a little bit of where it is going. So historically, deal.II really was not anything that was planned. It was a project like many, many others that started in a research group in Heidelberg, where my co-authors, Ralph Hartman, Guido Kernstedt, and myself, we needed software for ourselves. We all were working in a research group that dealt with numerical methods. We needed something that would support our own PhD thesis, and in the case of Guido, his postdoc work. And we just wanted to implement something that was useful for ourselves. And then in 2000, the internet came around, and everybody just created a website. That was the new thing. And so we did as well. We just put the software on a website, not because we thought that we wanted to build a grand community and build a tool that would last for another 20 years, but simply because that's what you could do. And of course, in the meantime, we figured out many things of how to run these sort of communities and also how to build software, right? I mean, the very first versions of deal.II were definitely not as well documented and tested as they are today. But I think we figured a few of the things out. And what I would like to show you over the next maybe 15 or 20 minutes is what we think works, what we think we struggle with, and what we continue to have to work with in our community of deal.II developers and users. So what works? It's a vibrant project. So to me, one of the most amazing things is that we had three young scientists who really didn't plan this, build something that today has a community of many hundreds, maybe a few thousands of users. Over the years, we had 7 deal.II users in developer workshops, and maybe we'll count this one as the 8th one. From 2006 to 2019, and what you can see is that the number of people on the mailing list at these times has increased from 80 to last year over 1,000 already. The number of contributors, people who contributed to the software in that time, has grown from 15 to over 200. And I'm pretty sure that if I counted it today, so these are numbers from last year, if I counted it today, we'd be over 250. And I think that's fantastic. I really enjoy, and I think all of us in this project enjoy, that there is such a large community of people who feel like if they have something to contribute, they do. I'll show you another number in a minute that illustrates that. It's also a project that continues to really grow quite rapidly. So this is the number of lines of code in our source files in purple and in the tests in green from 1998 when we started to today. And so you see that between the tests and the sources, we have about 1.5 million lines of C++. The interesting part to me in this chart is that for the first 20 years until 1998, there is almost linear growth of approximately 3,000 lines of code per month. Which I think is fantastic. And what's even more fantastic, of course, is that over the last 2 or 3 years, it's become even more rapid. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we've brought in more people, that more people feel like they can contribute to the source code. And that is a community that I'm proud of, that there are so many people. Here's a few other things about what is happening. So in the release 9.2 that Timo mentioned, he said it's already out. I think it's still a couple of days away, but it's all technicalities of where exactly in our very long release task list we are. So here's a few of the things that are in there, big stuff. We have a new distributed triangulation class that is different from the parallel distributed triangulation class in that it is fully distributed. So if your coarse mesh is consists of hundreds of thousands of cells, then the parallel distributed triangulation class cannot deal with that because it has to copy or has to keep a copy of the coarse mesh on every processor, and this new class doesn't need to do that. There's also improved automatic and symbolic differentiation. There have been tests by Timo and one of his postdocs, Conrad, and by the group of Martin Kornwickler in Munich that have run deal.II on more than 300,000 cores and more than 4 trillion unknowns. And I mean, this is, to me, is a mind-boggling size. This is some of the biggest machines in the world, and it scales pretty well if you look at the graphs. There's better support for parallel HP methods. There's better support for particles. You might not think of deal.II as being a finite element library as something that deals with particles, but oftentimes you want to do things like you want to solve a fluid problem or an electromagnetics problem, and you want to track how particles in these fields move along. And there's better support for that now. And there's one tutorial already in 9.2 and 2 more coming up. There's better support for GPUs, for modern processors, for C++11. There's more Python. And there are 7 new tutorial programs, and I believe that's the biggest number we've ever had for a single release. All of that will be written up in more detail in the release paper that will come out in the next few days or in the next week. So if you're interested, we're going to post that on the website. Other things that are happening. There are more and more publications that come out every year. So in 2017, the last year for which I have a complete list, it was substantially over 200 publications already. That is something that is very important for us to show to our funding agencies, that there is a community of people who actually use it, so that we're not building a project for ourselves, but that we build a project for a whole community. And I would encourage you to tell us if you have a publication, even if it's a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, but any kind of publication that you write based on deal.II, please let us know so that we can put it on the website. I already mentioned that the number of people who contribute to deal.II has increased over time. So here's a graph that shows how many people contributed code in every quarter for the last 20 or so years. And you see that in the very beginning, it was really just the 3 people who started the project. But today, it's on the order of 30 people in every quarter. And if you look at the release, so we counted that there's at least 93 people who contributed code or documentation or fixes to this release. Almost 100 people contributed to one software release. I think that is amazing. There's also these release papers that we write for every release, and I believe it will have 17 authors this time. These are all people who have contributed in very substantial ways and who deserve to be on that paper. And I think that is an indication that this project is working well. I do want to point out that in both of these categories, this could be you. Right? All of our users we hope will contribute code, and that if this becomes a sustained enterprise where you feel like you want to participate in the project more than by just adding a single function, you too can be an author on one of these release papers. And I think there is no logical upper limit to the number of authors there should be on these papers. That should reflect who is really active in this project. So I would like to encourage all of you to become a part of this and to become a listed author of the library or on these papers. Here are a few other things that I think we have figured out since putting it onto the website in 2000. You can subdivide this into technical things and into non-technical things. And for me, as I feel today like I'm more a project manager than a software developer. So to me, the big things that we actually learned is not the technical stuff. But let me start with the technical side. So we managed to continue continued growth on the order of 3,000 lines per month over more than 20 years. And like I mentioned, in the last few years, it's more on the order of 5,000 lines per month. I think from the technical perspective, we also figured out pretty well how to write modular code. That our users and developers do not need to know the entirety of the library. As a matter of fact, today, none of us don't know the entire library. I've tried for a very long time to really understand every piece. It is not possible anymore. There are many parts of the library that I have never seen and do not understand. It would take me a long time to read through it. So I think we managed to write code in a way that allows for this to happen, where not everybody needs to know everything. I think we have pretty good documentation. We also have a very good test suite. So for those of you who may not know much about the technical infrastructure of deal.II, every test, every change is run through a very large collection of tests that verify that everything is correct and that we don't break functionality. And that is what guarantees that deal.II is high quality software. This test suite has more than 12,000 tests now. And I think that is substantially larger than any other scientific computing project that I know. The more interesting thing for me as a project manager is the social lessons behind this. That we have an enterprise that does not consist of 3 people sitting in adjacent rooms anymore, like we were in Heidelberg in 2000. But now we have a worldwide enterprise of dozens of people who contribute to this and hundreds who use it. And it's quite an interesting project to work with in this regard. So we have attracted many, many more developers, like I mentioned. We have a quite dedicated and highly active group of maintainers. And I think we have developed fairly good strategies for teaching, right? So through the tutorials, through the video lectures, through workshops that we run. The things that are challenging and interesting is that when you have communities this big, of course, you have many more users and they have many more questions. On the other hand, you might not have quite as many people who can help with these questions as there are questions. And so you need to figure out ways how you can support a community of users with the resources that you have. So among the challenges are how do you provide a forum where people can ask for help? How do you provide documentation that avoids that people have to ask questions? All of these sort of things. And then there's, of course, other questions like most of the original developers, or most of us who have been with the project for, let's say, 10 or 15 years, we've progressed in our careers as well. We have other responsibilities. We sit on committees. We need to not find jobs for ourselves anymore, but help our department hire people. And all of these sort of things take time. So how do you deal with this as a project? How do you work around this? And then there's a inherent friction if you have a project of this size where you have different communities. So you have the principal developers, that are the people who maintain the library and do a fair share of the development. And there's a much larger community of developers and contributors, and then an even larger community of users. And from a social perspective, when you have these sort of different sub-communities, there is always potential for conflict in this that you have to think about. I think conflict is not, I don't want to say that this is a bad thing. It is just something that has to be managed, things that you have to think about how you organize that. So for example, we want to have more contributors to the library. How do we encourage others to contribute code? How do we make sure that when somebody comes in and says, here, I've got this function that I think could be useful to others, that we make the bar to entry low enough that it's worth everybody's while, right? We want to encourage people to contribute to code, and I think we do a fairly decent job in doing that. But of course, at the same time, we need tests, we need documentation, and how do we ensure the quality of the library when we accept contributions from people who may not have 20 years of software development experience? There is a conflict between these different goals, and I think one of the things that we've been putting a lot of effort and a lot of time into is to encourage people to contribute and then to mentor them into becoming better software developers by showing them how to write documentation and showing them how to write tests, for example. So I think what I want to say with this is that that is not a conflict in the sense of us against them where two people clash, but that it is something that we can work together where in the end everybody is better off this way. So I hope that you see this as an encouragement to contribute. There are other things, for example, between developers and users where we have to think about this. So there is clearly a limit to how much every one of us can spend time answering mails on the mailing list. How can we organize this in a more equitable way? So can we encourage our users to also help answer questions on a mailing list? And I hope that one of the things that comes out of a workshop like this or a collection of talks like this is that if you know us in person, that it becomes easier for you to stick your neck out and answer a question that you know the answer to. It's very difficult to answer questions on a forum where you don't know the people. And I hope that by giving you a face to who we are, that maybe you feel encouraged to also answer questions on a mailing list if you know the answer. One of the things that matters to us, I just want to bring this up in one slide, is that it costs money. It costs a lot of time for any of us to develop the software, to teach, to work on specific projects. That is something that we are measured. I am an employee of a university. Most of my colleagues who are principal developers are employees at universities or research labs, and we are evaluated based on research output. So in some sense, we have to document why we do this. And that is something that requires, for example, that we can illustrate that there are funding agencies like the National Science Foundation who are willing to support us because they understand that what we provide is a resource for the community. There are funding agencies that do this, and I think we're all very grateful for it. What we need to be able to do is demonstrate that what we do is useful to more than just us. And that is why I would like to encourage you to submit whenever you have a publication that uses deal.II to tell us about it, so we can put it on the website and collect it in our documents. Also, if you run a funded project by the National Science Foundation or any of the other agencies in the United States, or in fact worldwide, if you have a project that in the project description says, we will use deal.II, or if that's just what you do, tell us about it, and we would be very happy to list this. I think that goes both ways. It's good for your project if it gets to see some visibility. It's good for us to document that there are a number of other funded projects that use deal.II. So what I'm trying to say with all of this, and that's my last slide, is that I think deal.II, even though it was never planned that way, is a fairly cool and active project 22 years on, or almost 23 years after it was founded, that there is still a lot of activity and that the activity is growing. Nothing makes me happier than this. And that we want you all to be part of this project as users, as contributors, as potential future principal developers, maybe as somebody who answers questions on the forum. We're one big community where we build software that helps people do research. And I hope you feel welcome and encouraged to participate in this community. So that's what I had to say in terms of introduction to today's program. And so if there are questions, I'd be very happy to answer whatever you want to know. And otherwise, I'll also be equally happy to pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I'll give you guys a few minutes to see if there are any questions. And maybe to start things off, I'll ask you something. It looks like we're growing over the years, like in all metrics that you showed, right? So more commits, more participants, more whatever. Is this just going to continue to grow? And are you afraid of anything happening if the growth continues like this?
No, actually, I'm very encouraged by the growth. I think it's fantastic. I mean, so growth is difficult to manage if you don't have the manpower, right? But we have more developers, more principal developers today than we've ever had in the past. I forgot the exact number. I think it is 12 now. And I think between these 12, we are very good at having different responsibilities in this project. We have our own area of expertise. I worry about our ability to answer questions on the mailing list. Although I have to say that the volume of questions on the mailing list has not grown in proportion to the size of the library or the size of the user community. And I think that's a very encouraging sign. I think it means that by and large, we provide better documentation than we did 10 years ago, for example. But we get patches reviewed, we get new users onboarded, we get new developers onboarded, we help them grow as developers, and I think by and large this project is working pretty well. I think we've also managed between many of the principal developers to explain to our employers and funding agencies that this is worthwhile stuff to support. And I mean, you, Timo, and I, we have a jointly funded National Science Foundation project that pays us to do the work on deal.II that I think is worth doing, and I know that some of my colleagues in Europe do too. So I am not overly worried. I think 15 years ago I might have thought that C++, it's going to go away. Somebody else is going to come along and rewrite the whole thing in Python. But I'm not worried about this anymore. I think we keep up with the development of C++, and I think it is a project that is as relevant as it ever has been. Yep. So I'm not too concerned. Yes. I'm 46 now. I've got another 20 years in my career, and I'm not sure if I'm going to keep doing this for 20 years, but this is a project that's going to keep me busy for most of my career, from grad student time to retirement.
Awesome.
Who would have thought, right?
Yes. Well, we'll see where deal.II is in 20 years. I have two questions that might be a little bit technical, so maybe there's just a short answer for you right now. So the first one from Andreas Hegendorfer is, what are the improvements of automatic differentiation in 9.2?
That's something that I should give my colleague Jean-Paul Pelteret an opportunity to answer. I forgot, is he on the schedule for today, or?
No, but I'm online here.
Then why don't you go right ahead?
Sure. So I guess that bullet point is a little bit generous. I don't think we had any specific improvements in the automatic differentiation. Certainly not anything I can recall off the top of my head, and doesn't look like in the changelog. But we certainly made some improvements with symbolic, the symbolic framework. Yeah. So what we did with the symbolic framework, if it's of any interest, is that we now have a symbolic function. So just like your all the traditional function classes, this constant function, cosine function, those sort of things, we now have a symbolic function that can compute its derivatives as well, which is pretty nice. That's something that Luca had implemented. And then we've now also got a special tool that allows you to accelerate the evaluation of symbolic expressions. So this can quite often take some time to do. And now we're able to pass off this these complicated expressions to tools that can either simplify them, perform common sub-expression elimination, or do things like compile the expressions themselves for some much needed performance improvements. Yeah, JP, so that about summarizes it.
A follow-up for this is, can I use this as for a Newton method? Can I use automatic differentiation capabilities to, I guess, build derivatives for the Newton system automatically?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had that capability since 9.1. There are a couple of helper classes there that allow you to do these sort of linearizations, either at, let's say, a cell level, so you compute the linearization of a residual of an actual finite element itself, or what I call on the quadrature point level for, let's say, linearizing constitutive laws. So you can do things at either of these two levels, and the symbolic toolbox can be used primarily for quadrature point level operations, and we're working towards getting the same sort of capabilities to do finite element computation symbolically.
Awesome.
So the confusion between symbolic and automatic is mine, not in the documentation. I keep getting confused by the two of them. That is definitely not Jean-Paul's problem. There is already a tutorial program about automatic differentiation in the form of step 33, which is maybe not the very best we've ever written. But I think there will be more in the future that illustrate all of the things that Jean-Paul just talked about.
Yeah, that's right. We have at least plans to add an additional 2 tutorials. And in fact, there's already code gallery examples that are perhaps a little bit more explanatory than the existing tutorial as well. It's just a matter of time till we port one of those to the tutorial list themselves. Yeah, but that's certainly a top priority for us.
And any help from anybody in the user community is, of course, always very welcome.
Naturally, yes.
And if you want to learn more, the newest release paper, when we publish it in a couple of days, should also have a section about the symbolic and automatic differentiation if you want to know more. There's one question from Sean. He wants to use the microphone. I guess it's a question for Wolfgang. Sean, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks very much. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I was just curious, you know, a lot of the primary developers tend to find their homes in mathematics departments. And on your slides, Wolfgang, I didn't realize that you're also in the Department of Geosciences now. So I just wonder how people think about, because oftentimes, right, people want to solve PDE problems, but not necessarily be a mathematician about it. I mean, I don't know, that's probably not the right way to phrase it, but hopefully my kind of the drift of my question comes across in that just how do you see deal.II as something that might live in a computational mechanics you know, department, or just sort of, yeah, when it comes to the people? And yeah, thank you.
I think that is mostly historical coincidence. So I mean, I am a professor of mathematics, but you know, in reality, I'm a professor of computational science, and it is not a coincidence that I'm also in the geosciences department, because that's what I've worked on for a long time. Jean-Paul, when he was in at the university, was in a computational mechanics department. So was Dennis. Bruno and Daniel are in National Lab in the computational science division. So I think all of us, well, you know, we don't quite fit into any traditional math department. So you find a home wherever you can find one. But I think I think there's really no particularly good reason why we should be in one or the other. I can, yeah, like I mentioned, there are quite a number of exceptions to the point where it's not a rule anymore that we're in math department.
And it's great to have specialists in their respective areas too. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Wolfgang. I think we should move on. I know there are more questions. You can ask on the forum if they're more generic about tutorial programs. And there's also an open question period at the end after all the talks are finished. You're welcome to come back here. But I thought we should move on and give Martin a chance to also talk.
That's right. So, and I will try to answer some of the questions on the chat.
That's also great. Awesome.